Hello, everybody. This is Warriors of the Shadow, a bold quest for worldwide emotional intimacy. I'm extremely thrilled and honored to have Becca with us today because she's an expert in many things I'm truly passionate about. So it's going to be a really thrilling journey for all of us. And to get started, Becca, would you introduce yourself to our lovely audience?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to participate in the summit and this really worthy theme. And to give a brief introduction of myself, I am a counseling astrologer and also a teacher. I currently teach as an adjunct professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Jungian Psychology and Archetypal Studies program. And I did my graduate work at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where I focused on philosophy and religion. And I studied the work of J.R. Tolkien and C.G. Jung, who are both extraordinary commentators on the shadow. So it's an honor to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, all your background knowledge is like fascinating because I have like experiential trips in all these matters, but you being a scholar for me is like just fascinating, and there is just so many questions in my head that we can explore. But first, I'm really excited about to see how you experience through your studies and for your own experience, like what is really going on right now in our collective subconscious. So what is the main theme which is really wants to bubble up in these coming years?
Well, it's definitely a potent time that we live in, and of course that's a huge theme, and I'm only one small person holding a perspective on it. But what I see through an astrological lens is that we're entering a time period of contraction and needing to really face the shadow, very much some of these themes that are connected to what this summit is about. And the primary alignment that I'm looking at that's happening astrologically is a conjunction of two planets, Saturn and Pluto. And Saturn archetypally has to do with boundaries and division and structures. It's the challenges we face, the obstacles and the blockages. Saturn is the archetype of pain and suffering and loss, but it's also the archetype of maturity and wisdom and commitment and responsibility. So you can see there's this kind of range of shadow and noble potentials within each planetary archetype. Now, Pluto, on the other hand, is the archetype of the depths, of the underworld, of transformation, of the death, rebirth mystery, dying and being reborn, like the phoenix, dying in fire and rising from the ashes. And so the alignment of these two planets, Saturn and Pluto, what we would expect to see, and what we do see when we look back through the historical record, is each time these two planets come into alignment, those archetypal themes associated with Saturn and Pluto, they combine, and we see them correlated with world events unfolding around the globe and in human interactions. And so it's often a time period of contraction, of crisis, of division. There's often a kind of othering that takes place, a recognition of enemies or evil, or a splitting off even. There can be this kind of projection of the shadow onto the other, and it's like an us versus them mentality. And so if we actually look back through history, Saturn-Pluto alignments have often correlated with war-torn periods. Just to give a couple examples, the First World War started under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. The Second World War started under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. The Vietnam War started under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. In the States, 9/11 happened under a Saturn-Pluto alignment. So very heavy material that's associated with these alignments, but also what emerges in those periods are individuals who have forged in response to these unfolding events a capacity to have a moral sensibility to really face that challenge and that heaviness, or we could even say evil, to use a very weighty term, and to be able to bring about a deep foundational transformation in response to it. So it's a time period of very deep maturing and coming to terms with reality. And I used that term contraction earlier. Saturn-Pluto alignments tend to be like a contraction. And we can think of that as in a narrowing of focus, of things getting more difficult, of feeling kind of squeezed in a tight situation. But we can also think of a birth contraction, and how the contractions of birth, they're very Saturnian, but they're propelling something forward. They're propelling the baby from the darkness of the womb, the enclosure of that space, which has been, so nurturing during the period of gestation, but suddenly starts to feel too small, like a trap, when the contractions begin. But the contractions serve a larger purpose of bringing that being out into the world, into a completely radically different scenario of no longer being in the womb, but of actually being out in the world. So I like to try and hold the multiple sides of that perspective, and really appreciate that word contraction for the multivalence of its meaning and what it indicates. So in some ways, I feel like we can think of our current moment as like a contraction, and it may indeed be a birth contraction. And those of us alive right now have the opportunity to participate in what that birth could be, so long as we stay conscious and stay aware and stay connected to each other, rather than that other tendency of splitting off or othering or blaming others, and really being able to rather look to our own inner work, to what's happening within as well as what's happening outside of us.
It's such a beautiful picture, and makes me really excited that I believe that many people feel the contractions, feel the pain, but they don't associate it that it's actually the beginning of a birth. So your line of thought can be really helpful for many to like relate to this pain as birthing into something new. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions how to get even more connected to the ideas that we don't have to fear the pain, the contraction. How can we really ride this wave to connect to our own soul deeper and to each other, to like annihilate animosity and indifference to each other?
Well, I'm very influenced by the work of Stanislav Grof, who is one of my teachers. And he has this beautiful quote where he says, "All pain is birth pain. All pain is birth pain." And that the idea of the contraction, for any woman who's actually physically given birth, you'll know about this, that the pain of the contractions, they're creating pressure, and that there are different ways to relate to such pain, and coming down to the place of recognizing that pain itself is sensation. Pain actually reminds us that we're alive. That's the interesting thing with pain, in whatever form it comes to us, that it really narrows our focus. You know, if you've injured yourself, or your back is out, or especially if one is, you know, suffering from chronic pain, it's a lot harder to focus on the bigger picture, because pain is so immediate. It's something in our bodies that says, attend to this now. And there is, of course, the impulse to numb pain. And especially when pain reaches a certain degree, that can become a very overwhelming impulse. You know, we can't focus on the broader picture, on the other things of our life, if we are always in chronic pain. So of course there's a balance there. But I do feel like one of the things that maybe we're struggling with in our current moment is a desire to numb the pain out, to numb out the pain of what's happening in our world, in terms of ecological crisis, in terms of international divisions, in terms of racial divisions and tensions, that there's a desire rather to look away, to distract ourselves, as a means of numbing. And we have so many ways to distract ourselves now, with social media and technology, and just 10,000 shows, it seems, appearing, you know, every week to be streamed. And so there's a lot of different ways for us to tune out to what's happening. And so in terms of this idea of staying with the pain, and therefore staying with the current moment, I feel like having practices, especially within community, intimate community, that allow you to contact what is unfolding in the world on a global scale, but also on your local scale. I think one of the things that's really hard right now is, you know, we're all so interconnected in terms of news, information. It's very hard to keep up. And it does feel, well, not just does it feel like there's a crisis happening every day, there is a crisis happening every day somewhere on the earth. And we hear about it. We hear about it immediately through the news. And I think that in itself, this overload of information and seeing the destructiveness around the globe, there comes a point where our capacity for empathy maybe starts to wear down. It's more than we as individuals, or we as small communities can take in. So that opens up the question for me, not, you know, should we be blocking out all this information that we have access to, but maybe of finding ways to take it in doses, and then choose that part of what's happening in our world that you can attend to, that's on a local scale, that's affecting your personal community, or that you feel especially that it meets you in your heart in some way. And instead of numbing out, being able to focus your attention on one particular area of pain, and putting your love and your care into finding healing for that. And I can't help but imagine, you know, if every person was doing that, or if every community was doing that, we are thinking on this more community scale, maybe bioregional level, what changes could happen that we would see reflected on a global scale. Because it's too much for any one individual or any small community or organization to take on the vastness of the world's challenges right now. But that also doesn't mean we should just cut ourselves off from them or isolate ourselves. So I feel like it is this finding a middle path and an issue of scale to figure out what we can meet with our own resources and energy and community support.
Yeah, it sounds like a very grounding and very connecting way of dealing with that together. And at the same time, I believe when we have the courage to face that, the whole pain can actually turn into some kind of ecstatic adventure, because we breach through a certain kind of threshold, and then we go into a kind of different realm. So like we start to relate to the world in a different way. It's like it becomes kind of like a hero's quest, a journey that we share, but we still have our own individual flavor for it. So like you being a scholar of Tolkien and Jung probably have a lot of insight, like how we connect our own personal hero's quest, what's happening all around the world.
I am definitely very influenced by Tolkien's stories, particularly, of course, his most well-known one, The Lord of the Rings, which is a it is a hero's quest. And what I love about The Lord of the Rings is that, unlike Joseph Campbell's hero's journey that focuses on, just one hero, The Lord of the Rings is a hero's plural journey. It's about a fellowship. So it's about multiple people in relationship with each other, helping each other along the way. And this idea that no task can actually be accomplished alone. So when we think of that hero's journey and the adventure even of carrying this task or seeing this burden through to its end, that it's not about trying to do it all by ourselves. It's rather about forging the connections or deepening the connections that we already have with those people that will allow us to see that task to completion. Because the tasks that are facing us, just like Frodo carrying the ring into Mordor, the tasks that are facing us are far bigger than any one little individual can carry. And if we can do that with the help of, of our own Sam, Frodo and Sam, or if we can do that with the help of our own fellowship, then it makes that all the more likely that the quest will be successful. And there is this feeling, as you were speaking to, that when we're engaged with meaningful work, even if it's challenging, even if it's difficult, that sense of purpose, that sense of being connected to something larger, has such a vital life force that courses through it that we can connect to. And in some ways, it feels like perhaps this is why all of us who are alive in this time, in this current era, why we're here, to be able to carry what is unfolding in the world right now, to be present for it. Another one of my teachers who I've been very influenced by is Joanna Macy. And she speaks about being with the pain of the world, and that when our heart breaks open on behalf of the world, that's how our love can come out. That love and grief are two sides of the same coin. And when we feel the pain of our hearts breaking open on behalf of the suffering in the world, that's when our love can come forth, and when we're compelled to take action, to step forward on that hero's journey that you were speaking about.
Mm. Yeah, that's really reminds me to an idea that I started to entertain, and that's how one reason why I started to create this whole summit, that I realized, like, yes, going through pain and suffering is really a very profound channel to open up for love to ourselves and to other people. And now wondering, if we break through, will we ever be able to divorce from the need of suffering? I'm not talking about circumventing it. I'm talking about like transcending, and then just stepping into a new era as a human collective, as an evolutionary new step, when we kind of can divorce from the need of suffering, and we can have new vehicles to like be in love, and then just like having a more and more and more colorful journey. So I'm wondering if you see a potential, and if there is something, what could be a way to access that?
Hmm. I have a variety of responses that come up in connection to that idea, because I absolutely do believe that that kind of breakthrough is possible. And even if we think of, again, speaking about that birth process, we go from being in the unified kind of blissful experience of being in the womb until we become too large for that. And we can think of this both literally in terms of our own birth process, or metaphorically in terms of a paradigm or a worldview. And that we grow and we grow and then become too big for the womb, and that is what triggers the birth contractions, and suddenly the world becomes too small and it's too challenging, and the contractions are pushing us into the birth canal. And of course, in the birth canal is this deep struggle for survival, but there's also this sense of light on the other side, that there's the possibility of release. That's kind of what gives us the energy to move through. And then finally we are born or reborn or released into the world, into an utterly different paradigm. And that birth process, and again, I'm very much drawing on the work and ideas of Stanislav Grof when I speak about this, that cycle, it's an archetypal cycle of death and rebirth. And we see that if we look through history, and now I'm also, you can tell I'm a scholar, I'm trying to cite all my sources here as I'm speaking. I'm also drawing here on ideas that have very much influenced me from my own father, Richard Tarnas. He's a cultural historian, and he wrote a book called The Passion of the Western Mind, where he looks through history and sees that same pattern, that kind of death rebirth mystery unfolding through the paradigm shifts of history. And so that rebirth into a liberating new paradigm is something that, as you were talking about, is most definitely something I feel we have access to, and that we experience. And maybe right now we are indeed in the process of opening up into a new, more liberated, more spiritually connected world, or paradigm. But I also wonder if that cycle in itself, that larger cycle, is meant to continue to repeat, but perhaps at new levels. So that even as we are reborn at, you could say, a higher level of consciousness, or into a different paradigm or way of being or relating to each other, that that too has a growth process, and that at some point that will need to also go through its own death and then rebirth to reach the next level of consciousness or growth or development. So I kind of want to say it's maybe both, and that there is this capacity to transcend, to move beyond, but the archetypal patterning of that death rebirth mystery perhaps stays with us. That's what opens the doorway to the next level, the next possibility, so that our growth as individuals, our growth maybe as a human species, doesn't stagnate, or that we suddenly reach this new level but don't go any further. So, I don't necessarily know the time scales of that, and I'm speaking about an archetypal pattern that you can see in everything from the birth of an individual human being to the changes on the scale of a great civilization, or a great worldview. So I guess from that perspective, I don't necessarily see the the growth edge or the growth pains, you could say, as being something that we fully leave behind, that maybe it's something that we're coming to understand more, coming back to that idea of, if all pain is birth pain, then when we face that challenge, there is a recognition that there is something on the other side, and that we can go willingly into that death rebirth process because we know the rebirth is on the other side of the death. And so there is a trusting in it. And perhaps that in itself is that kind of shift in consciousness that you're speaking to.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's kind of like creates this exciting feeling in me, like the possibility of a perpetual rebirth, like getting into new and new realms, and it's like accelerating how much more emotions and experiences and life adventures we can have at once. So it's kind of like creating in me this idea that the moment, space, and time kind of expands and like getting filled with more and more richness of the experience of existence. So it's kind of creates in me this delicious anticipation that it's in within reach, and it's already happening on many ways. And what's there is one thing what really excites me, and I'm really curious what you think about that, because we talked about this massive collective shadow integration what we're doing right now, and somehow I have this feeling like individuals have a much bigger capacity than we can imagine to do shadow integration on the collective level, like how Frodo was having his own journey and transformation, but just like taking the symbol of the ring, he tossed it into the fires of Mordor. That was kind of like a collective shadow was gone, so not integrated, but there was like a big change that changed the currents of event for everybody. So I'm like wondering like how you relate to or individual potentials to have such an impact, to access to changes like that.
I feel that we absolutely do have that individual potential to, in many different ways. There's the work that we just, the inner work, the deep inner work that we do in ourselves that ripples out, because if we're doing that work, then we affect those we're in closest relationship to, which then affects further and further out, like ripples in a pond. And I think perhaps that's possible both in kind of an external sense, such as inspiration, or how we connect on a, at a more relational level externally in relationships, but also perhaps internally as well with deep spiritual work. I'm going to cite yet another scholar who's inspired me, whose work is also connected to some of what I was speaking to before, of that death rebirth cycle, or that archetypal pattern of death and rebirth, bringing us to higher and higher, or greater and greater levels of consciousness, or spiritual opening. And this is Christopher Beisch, and he speaks about the way individuals doing deep inner healing work through non-ordinary states of consciousness and a variety of methods, that especially as we maybe work through some of our own personal material, we work through the layers of our personal healing, our family wounding, relational healing, then we actually maybe start to work through healing on a collective level. We start working through the karma of not only ourselves as individuals, or our more intimate relational field, but maybe that we're actually enacting healing on the species level, the level of the human species, and are moving through the built up pain or suffering that is accumulated from generations past. And he very strongly feels, and from personal experience, that we can do that deep work, not just on behalf of ourselves, but on a wider scale. And again, I feel like, the number of individuals who are engaging in that kind of work, that yes, they can be these points of both internal and external healing. As I was speaking before, the external of how we affect others rippling out in our lives, and the internal of doing this collective healing work on perhaps a more subtle level or a spiritual plane. So, I'm having this image keep coming up, and it's connected to what we were talking about before with this metaphor of birth. Another metaphor that I've heard multiple individuals use to describe our time, and it's one that for me feels very personally resonant, is the butterfly in the cocoon. And of course, the caterpillar doesn't know that it will become the butterfly, or we presume that. But when the caterpillar goes into its cocoon, it dissolves completely. There's nothing left of what it was before. And the only thing that provides continuity between the caterpillar and the butterfly it will become are these little cells called imaginal cells. And I just love that as someone who is a scholar of the imagination and truly believes in the deep primal power of what the imagination is, that each of us is connected to. I love that these cells are called imaginal cells, because it's the part of the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. It's the part of the caterpillar that can still imagine that it could be the butterfly. And it's those imaginal cells that provide the continuity between caterpillar and butterfly, and then grow into the new body and head and antenna and wings of the butterfly. And I like to think perhaps of those individuals who feel called to carry the burden of the collective in that way as something like these imaginal cells, providing the continuity between an old world or old world view that is dying, that is undergoing a loss and a death process, and that they can provide that continuity into becoming a butterfly, into becoming a new world, a new worldview or paradigm. And so again, for those who feel called to that, I do believe that they are like these imaginal cells carrying something between worlds as we are in this process of transformation.
It's just fascinating for me, like how these cells are actually called like that, and it really triggered in me this idea, there's this whole world of imagination, and in our current culture we call to it's often we say like, oh, it's just imaginary if it wasn't real, but it's another layer of reality. And I see great confusion about that. So I see people on both sides and between, but what really came up to me when you were talking about that, like there are those let's just call them metaphysical beings, which in my opinion they are real, but they're just real differently, not physically real. But somehow there's this huge potential of those who go under this quest and this deep transformation from the self and for the collective, that they are really being helped by those imaginary or metaphysical beings, because they are also part of the game. And I wonder what's your own opinion about the relationship with non-physical beings, how much you relate to them, how much your work is harnessing their potential or their existence, or what's their relationship to our physical world.
I love that you brought up the way that these terms around imagination, they get disparaged. So, oh, it was just imaginary. It was only made up. It was merely a fantasy. And that we use these denigrating words, just, merely, only, to bring down something that is actually, I feel, a powerful source of knowledge. And the Sufi scholar Henri Corbin, who was part of Carl Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, part of his circle in Switzerland, Henri Corbin spoke about the difference between what he defined as the imaginal and the imaginary. And he defines that difference as the imaginary is what is just simply made up. It's what we kind of invent off the top of our head. It's not true. It's not connected to anything else. The imaginal, on the other hand, Corbin defines as the act of imagining perception, and it is connected to something real. And he speaks about the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination, and that it is a world in between. So it's not the world of abstract thought. It's not the material physical world. It is a permeating world that's in between, that is in no place, and yet it is a place. So I can't point how to get there. It's almost like a leap of faith or a leap of imagination to get there. But the way to enter into the imaginal realm, depending on whose perspective you're taking, can be the journey of mystics. It could be the journey of deep psychological exploration. I definitely feel that Carl Jung and his deep explorations of the collective unconscious, that's the realm he also crossed into, the imaginal realm. I even feel that J.R.R. Tolkien and what he's hinted at in his writings and his letters, the way that his stories emerged actually comes through a crossing over that threshold into the imaginal realm. And the figures that one encounters there are, we can call them imaginal persons. And as you were saying, if we accept them as real, not as physically real, but as imaginally real or psychologically real or spiritually real, not embodied, but independent from us, nonetheless, there is a tremendous amount that we can learn from them. And I feel like, again, there's a number of different ways one could approach talking about this. We can talk about it psychologically. We can talk about it spiritually. We can talk about it even in terms of art and creativity. I think for some, that's maybe a more comfortable way to enter into it. Where do great stories come from? Where does beautiful art come from? Artists and authors often talk about how they feel like their stories or their creations have come through them rather than simply making it up. It's not just imaginary. So we can access it through art just as much as we can through, say, psychology, or through non-ordinary states of consciousness, or through meditation or spiritual practice. I personally start to see an intersection between all of those things rather than differentiating them out into, here's the spiritual or the religious category, here's the psychological and the emotional category, here's the the creative, the artistic. I actually feel like these are they're all very interconnected avenues that are bringing us into this, you could say, co-creative realm where we can come into relationship to archetypal figures, to these imaginal figures that can indeed give us wisdom and knowledge and the inspiration to take on the tasks that that face us in the world today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just very beautiful frontiers, and even I'm just thinking about, like, even with the internet, we using technology, we are kind of loosening up. Like, even me, like, not physically present, but I feel like much more present with you than with sometimes with people sitting in the same room. So it's just fascinating for me how our technology is really loosening up this whole rigid idea of physicality. But at the same time, I don't think people often make the connection between that, but still still being somewhat influenced it. And then it brings up a very interesting question for me, like, as you were talking about, like, yeah, on a certain way we are all one, we all talk about that, or religions talk about that, but we have our own individuality. And somehow I see that there is just a beautiful dance between the idea, like, oh, this is me, and this is something which is not me but still me. Like especially with Jung's work, I often think about, like, okay, what is really my own psyche, and what is something which is like a different entity is communicating with me. And I wonder, I mean, there is not necessarily need to have a distinction, but I'm just really curious how you see that, like, how to really use it powerfully, that what is me and what is something that communicates through me.
That's such a great question. And it's, I, you're touching on something that I think is so important, because often in psychology, or in certain branches of psychology, everything that we experience psychologically kind of gets isolated into our individual psyche, if you can even draw a line around that. So we interpret our dreams by saying, oh, well, these are all facets of my personality. Or sometimes this can be an interpretation of Carl Jung's Red Book, that the figures he encountered in his confrontation with the unconscious they're all just facets of Jung, facets of his personality. But there's another way of seeing this, and I think this is very much what Jung is speaking to when he talks about the collective unconscious versus the personal unconscious. And you could almost see it as though the personal psyche, the personal unconscious, opens out into the collective. And maybe there isn't a hard line between the two of them, but rather we are like, we as individuals are like a nexus point for these archetypal qualities, these archetypal beings from the collective to come through. And when they meet us as individuals, they take on particular forms. They get expressed through us in our own way, but they are also expressions of the collective. And so I very much see it as a blending of both, of personal and collective, and that we can think of it maybe as a co-creation or a participation between us as individuals and between this kind of archetypal patterning that is not yet determined of the collective unconscious. And when the two meet, then something that is a blend of neither personal, holy, or collective arises. So perhaps that's why, we encounter through, meditation, or something like active imagination or non-ordinary states of consciousness, we encounter archetypal figures, but they're in different guises. It's like they come to us in the guises that we can meet them in, because they're meeting us as who we are. And that's the kind of participatory nature of the imagination, or of the imaginal realm, or that in-between realm, to use that idea again. That there's something wholly collective and then something personal, and it's meeting there. But I do think, speaking again more psychologically, that there's definitely a very personal layer that needs to be worked through to come to this more collective layer, so that we can learn to withdraw our projections, or recognize what we're projecting out there that may be more personal material, like personal shadow material or personal woundings or something like that, that we not only project out onto other people in our lives, but maybe project inward onto the collective, and say, like, whether we say that something that is maybe more personally flavored is collective, or whether we identify something that's collective as more relevant to us. And it's a fine line, because if we identify something that's collective as more relevant to us, that's where, say, spiritual inflation comes in. This sense of, we have a very profound, say, spiritual experience, and think that we're the only ones who've had that, or this sense of being the personal savior or something like that. So this need to differentiate what is ours at a individual or personal biographical level, and what is collective. Jung said something, that just because I see something significant doesn't mean that I am significant. And of course, he's not just disparaging himself and saying I'm insignificant, but rather, sometimes, especially in deep spiritual experiences, we are able to witness something that is far beyond us as individuals. And we've been given the privilege of this glimpse, so that it can aid us in our journey. But to remember not to identify with it, to not say, well, this is me, this is a part of me, and therefore, I'm at this more elevated level than somebody else, but rather to keep our spiritual and also psychological humility in the face of such profound experiences. I hope that helps kind of answer or connect with the question you're bringing forward of that personal and the collective.
Oh, absolutely. And I love what you're saying about this. And then it brings up this challenge, which is, it's a very interesting challenge to, like, how to own our own power, or transformative power, without falling prey to a huge ego trip. So it's kind of like such a delicate balance, because like seeing our power and using it in a way that it doesn't become this inflated thing, is just, it appears to me such a fine line. And
Definitely.
And I wonder what's your approach on, like, really being able to walk this fine line, not to, like, fall off on either side.
Well, I definitely don't claim to have all the answers, or to have necessarily achieved that fine line, even if I attempt to walk it. But I think what can be a helpful perspective is that sense of power, that sense of empowerment. Again, if we can see it as something coming through us, that we can be vessels for that power, and vessels for that wielding that, so that, again, we don't egoically identify with it. We don't say, well, this is my power, but rather, this is a power that's coming through me for some reason in this time. And to be able to direct it as can be both most beneficial to whatever it is we're needing to address or meet. So again, that image of each of us as individuals as a nexus point, as a container, as a vessel for, you could say, archetypal powers that are beyond us, that are infinitely greater than us, but in our own individual ways, they come through us. I mean, this is what, when we look at someone's birth chart, for example, in astrology, what we're looking at is what their particular personal patterning is for those archetypal qualities to come through. So we all have the same archetypes within us, just like we're all born with the same planets in our chart. We're all reflections of the same solar system, of the same macrocosm, but they're all in utterly unique configurations that are particular to each of us. And it's like the moment that we're born is the moment that the cosmos chose us to be that particular vessel for its infinite array of archetypal energies. And so we're simultaneously utterly unique in that patterning, and yet all carrying the same energies as they come through us. So that's at least a perspective that I try and draw on or connect to or speak to, that it's an energy, a creativity, a power that is channeling through us, that's something beyond who we are, and that we're just learning how to wield it. We're just learning how to be the best vessels, the best containers that we can be, so it can come through as clearly as possible. But it's inherently meant to be shaped by who we each are as individuals.
Oh, that's very, very helpful, like having this image of being a powerful vessel. And I think that could be like such a great closing picture to leave our audience with, just to encourage everybody to dare to be a very powerful vessel. And everybody has such a different delicious juices of life in this vessel radiating and can be shared. So I really encourage everybody to own this role of being a very powerful, beautiful vessel for each other and for ourselves. And thank you very much for all these deep and very valuable, invigorating thoughts. I'm really, really grateful that you shared your knowledge, your experience, your wisdom. It's such a great gift. It's such a powerful vessel for all of us. And thanks. And then I really hope that we're gonna have other ways to explore and take all these delicious depths to the surface, and more people can contribute and play, and then we become like beautiful verses of this divine poem that we are all sharing.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much. Deepest thanks for inviting me to speak with you. And I've so appreciated our conversation and the places that you've opened up in your inquiry and your questions, and the space you're holding, the vessel, the container that you're holding with this summit and with your work and everything that you're bringing together as a nexus point. So a deep gratitude to you as well.
Thank you. That has been my greatest pleasure. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.